I'd like to welcome today's speakers. Today, we're joined by Renato Alves, the project coordinator of BioIT at EMBL Heidelberg, Tony Burdett, who leads the archival infrastructure and technology team at the EBI, Maria Levchenko, the community manager for Europe PMC, and Sandra Orchard, the team leader for protein function content team, the team at the EBI who's responsible for Uniprot. So if you've been to any of the previous open access webinars, some of the panel may look familiar to you, but I'd like to start by asking them to introduce themselves and to include what open access means to them and where relevant, the resource that they work for. So Renato, would you be able to kick us off with your introduction? Thank you.
Sure. So hi everyone. So my name is Renato, as Anna mentioned. I'm the coordinator of the BioIT project at EMBL Heidelberg, and this project provides computational support at EMBL to the research community through training, to consulting, infrastructure, and other kinds of networking opportunities. So a little bit about my background. I have a background in cellular biology, but I actually started dabbling in computers and computation from a very young age, and I kind of picked it up a little bit more during my bachelor, also in biology, where I engaged with many different projects, most of them open source, and also different communities, and quite a few of them relevant to research and science. And since then, and during my PhD in biology at EMBL Heidelberg, where I worked on methods to integrate human metagenomic and metatranscriptomic data, I've been promoting open research best practices with emphasis on reproducibility. And to answer Anna's question about open access, what it means to me, it's a definition that has changed a little bit over the years. And right now, if I would have to kind of put an expression to it, I would say that it's not just working openly, but also caring for making the work accessible through documentation, simplified processes, and free or affordable resources. And with that, I pass it back to you, Anna.
Great, thank you. And can we move to Maria next, please?
Hello, everyone. So I'm Maria Levchenko, and I'm community manager for Europe PMC. Europe PMC is an open and free community resource for life science publications and preprints that is developed by EMBL-EBI. Europe PMC was established in 2007, and back then, our role was to support funder open access policies. And so that's the connection to open access that we have. However, over the years, we've grown to provide support for scientists who are working with scientific literature. And so in our work, open access has become more of an open science. And so for us, that is a much broader umbrella that includes things like open data and open software, but also open sourcing our own code, linking to open peer reviews, or working with open metadata like open citations or open licenses. And for me personally, open science has always been an important part. When I was doing my PhD in biochemistry, the main question that I had was, can we do science better? And that was what prompted me to transition to science management first with the European Research Council, and then later to move on to Europe PMC to find how discovery tools like Europe PMC could be helping scientists do their work easier. And so I believe that give it another 10, 20 years and the definition of open will probably change again. And hopefully we will start talking about things that we don't yet talk about, things like inclusive science, things like citizen science projects, and many other ideas that hopefully we can discuss today in this webinar.
Thank you, Maria. And next to Sandra, please.
So, hello, my name's Sandra Orchard from the EMBL-EBI. And as Anna said, I manage the Uniprot database, the curation content at the EBI, and also the EBI's contribution to the gene ontology annotation efforts. So all the data that we deal with is open, freely available to people to use and reuse in formats that we hope are easily accessible to you. We try and make all our software available too, the tools that we use for analysis. You can take the entire database if you like. I think it'll be a little bit big for most people's uses. Yes, and I've worked throughout my career at the EBI with bodies that have encouraged standardization and formatting of data, so it's most readily available for people to access and reuse, and also that data can be merged and integrated and thus become more useful as well, which to me is a large part of open data, is making sure that the data is readily available in formats that people can access and pick up themselves and work with, and that the data is easily integrated with other data types to make it as rich and as useful as possible to the scientific community. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And lastly to Tony, please.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. Hi, everyone. My name's Tony Burdett. As Anna mentioned, I'm the team leader at EMBL-EBI and for the Archive Infrastructure and Technology team. That puts me sort of a little bit at the coalface of data, really. We tend to deal with large numbers of submissions that come in to EBI resources. So I build technology for things like the back end of ENA, the European Nucleotide Archive, and the biosamples database, deal with a little bit of like managed access data through EGA. I'm also one of the co-leads for the Human Cell Atlas Data Coordination Platform, and my role there is to deal with data ingestion into that platform as well. So open access to me, I think, means lots of very data centric kind of approach to sort of open access, and tend to think in terms of FAIR data and the FAIR principles, especially. I work as part of an IMI project called FAIR Plus, which is very much about building and reaching out to pharmaceutical companies and IMI projects to think about how to make their data more fair, what processes you can adopt, what strategies you can adopt, a little bit like Sandra, a little bit what standards and things that you can assimilate and work with to try and encourage your data to be created fair, rather than have to sort of mine data archives that are out there and curate it for your use case. How can we encourage data to be born more fair, I guess. So yeah, that's the sort of, I have a very data centric perspective on FAIR. I also sort of a little bit leading into sort of the ideas of how do we ensure that data assets can be robustly identified so that you can reproduce analyses. So, you know, we always know what the inputs for an analysis pipeline or processing pipeline looks like. I'm also involved in efforts to look at the impact of things like GDPR within the Human Cell Atlas. So I also have a slightly regulatory or legislative slice on this, in terms of what does it actually mean for data to be anonymous or personally identifiable when it comes to genomic data. So a little bit of everything, but mostly if you've got questions about FAIR data, then I would be happy to answer those.
Great, thank you, Tony. So if anyone does have any questions at any point throughout this, please do type those into the Q&A box, and we can ask our panel. But we do have a few questions to get us started. And I was wondering, to start with, could we stick with Tony, and maybe you could briefly explain what you mean by FAIR and how that differs from open?
Yeah, good question. So FAIR, yeah, so I think we talk about FAIR with reference to the FAIR principles, which are findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And there's sort of within bioinformatics, there's quite a famous publication outlining the FAIR data principles. But they really sort of outlining this kind of approach of like, try and provide enough context, use good enough standards, and share your data in an appropriate way to make sure that others can find it, can get access to it without having to jump through some crazy hoops, that it's interoperable with other data that's sort of similar data sets that are available, and reusable, which means that mostly means that you can actually take the data and use it for a different purpose, that it's got an appropriate license on it, these sorts of things. So it's a very high level guiding set of principles about how it helps you share your data, but it's slightly different to open in the sense that you can be sort of fair without being open. So if you're internally fair, within your organization, your data assets are fair, they can be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable by anyone in the context of your organization, but not shared outside of that more openly. So not shared with sort of like a wider international ecosystem. Also, this is where the legislative angle comes in. If you've got personally identifiable data sets or data sets that are derived from humans, they might reasonably have controls over what that data can be used for and who it can be shared with. So it can still be findable, accessible, and interoperable and reusable, but only under certain conditions. So so FAIR is a good high-level guiding set of principles. It's not a silver bullet. It's not going to help you sort of magically go and figure out how to do all of these things, but it's a good set of principles to aspire to. And it's different to open fundamentally because you can be fair without being open. You can also be open without being fair, of course. You can pump your data out onto the internet to your heart's content, but if it's in some very esoteric format with no information to describe it, nobody's ever going to be able to find it or reuse it. So yeah.
Thank you. Yes, definitely requires a lot of thought in being fair, but that paper that you mentioned outlining the principles is very good at understanding those points. Okay, so I'll move on to the next question. Why should I even share my data? What's the point of sharing my data? And I'm sure that's something that all of us have an opinion on. Perhaps we could go to Sandra first with that one.
Yes, well, there are several very good reasons. First of all, our moral/financial. Of course, the data has been usually publicly funded, and I'm obviously not talking to those of you who work in private companies, but for most of us in the academic world, we're grant funded or we're funded by local governments. All the money ultimately comes from taxpayers, and if the taxpayers are funding your research, I think they have the right to expect that data to be put back and accessible to them, even if only a handful are subsequently going to use it. But I think the bigger picture, of course, is that the biomedical community relies on that data. It's the data that embeds everything that we do and that we build on, and working on a project, not making the data accessible at the end of it really means effectively your work has been wasted. Yes, it might make a nice paper, but papers get forgotten very easily. And burying the data then means that it will not be reused, it will not be built upon, there'll be no additional research that moves on from where you left off. So really, it's money wasted, it's time wasted, it's your effort wasted. So making the data open means you encourage collaboration, you encourage an extension of the information that you have generated. You allow people to turn your data into knowledge. So people like ourselves who work in databases and connect the data and link it to other pieces of information from other publications, and can then make it accessible to the whole biomedical community. Without the basic information that allows us to do that, then we'll just pass your paper by and move on to the next one. So it gives your data immortality, if you like, I suppose is the phrase I'm looking for. It keeps it in the public domain, and it keeps people working in that area, active in that area, and eventually solving the problems that you have contributed to, but not drawn a line underneath.
Maria, do you want to add on to that one?
Yes, and I think everything that Sandra said is absolutely true, but it does appeal to the sort of bigger good principle. And for those of us who might be a bit more individualistic, I just wanted to assure you that there are also very personal benefits to sharing your data. So for one, now many funders started to include kind of opening the data into their open access policies. That doesn't necessarily mean that the data will just be dumped onto the internet. Often it will refer to data being fair and shared to the limit that it can be shared with all of the, sort of limitations that it might hold, but that is something that is going to be asked of us. But also equally, it will be something that you can add on to your CV, and that is something that funders and institutions started looking at by sort of judging grant applicants or position applicants a bit more fairly. And there is a movement called based on the DORA principles, which prompts us to look exactly at that, not at the publications impact factor or citations, but at the science that you've done. And that means looking at the data. And another aspect of that is that, of course, when you open your data, other analysis might come up that sort of bring back that bigger impact that you would have had had you made your data fair and open beyond just publishing it in a paper. And so, you know, even from kind of a more personal perspective as a scientist, this is just something that makes sense for you. And beyond that, there is obviously a bigger picture for the scientific community as a whole, and obviously for the general public as well.
Yeah, so there's some good points there for science, for community, for individuals, lots of good reasons. Tony, did you want to add on yours?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of agree with everything Sandra and Maria just said, but I also, you know, I often hear this question of like, kind of, why should I share my data, or why should I make my data open? And for me, it's a little bit like saying, why should I publish my paper in a journal? Right, I can write it up. I've got all my lab research written down on my notepad. Right, why should I publish it in a journal? And it, you know, everyone's immediately thinking, yeah, but if I publish in a journal, then I've got publication history, and that's good for my career and everything else. Now that's incentives, and I would love to see better incentives around open data sharing. As a sort of bioinformatics community, I think this is something that's really important, really needed, to actually give people like credit and attribution for generating impactful data sets. But, you know, the idea that why should I share my data is for me a bit like saying, well, why should I write a paper? You know, it's the key underlying goal there is this kind of idea of standing on the shoulders of giants, right? You build on research of the people that have come before you, and we can build on research by building on the data from the people have generated before us. So, you know, it is the same question for me. It's like, actually, yeah, these are assets from research outputs. They're assets that we have generated for the community, and we should be able to share in a way that other people can build on.
And just thinking about that question a bit more broadly, so perhaps being open isn't just about data or papers. Renato, could you comment on why you might want to share your code or your code projects?
Yeah, so I was going to pick that up a bit later, but in this case, I agree with everything that Maria, Sandra, and Tony mentioned. But I would highlight a bit of a different perspective for software, at least. For instance, I would say that these days, if you want to have your software to be accepted in your community or in whatever research you're doing, you kind of necessarily need to do it openly, because there's so many more advantages to it. The fact that once you make it open, it doesn't just depend on you. You can build a community around it. It can become self-sustainable. Bugs and everything that come with the use of it get revealed because your community becomes larger, and all the users can eventually contribute as well. And you can have contributions at all levels, from documentation to just people helping on your channels and so on. So in terms of advantages for software and doing software development in the open, yeah, I see plenty, and I would say that it's almost scientific suicide to not do it openly these days. Yeah, and I would leave it there for now. Yeah.
Are there any disadvantages?
Yeah, so there are disadvantages. If you're pursuing, for instance, monetizing your software, or if you have different kinds of aspirations, you need to be careful with what kind of licenses you choose to make sure that they don't restrict what you want to do afterwards. It doesn't mean that you cannot do it, but you need to be careful with the choice of license, for instance. Yeah, that's at least the first that I would highlight. Of course, if you want to make your project open, you might be thinking, well, if I open my software too early, or yeah, depending when you do it, you might get some risks of someone perhaps trying to copy or to mimic whatever idea you have, to clone your project even. That's something that actually happens quite a lot in open source projects where someone tries to rebrand, for instance, the software. But in research, usually this doesn't happen because the work comes with names associated with them, and it's much harder to actually forge an identity that comes with contribution. And particularly these days, when the history of the projects themselves is all open, it's very easy to identify who were the main contributors and who actually helped making that software what it is today.
Tony.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of bounce off Renato's point and your question about are there disadvantages? And yeah, I agree with what Renato said about sort of code, and just to sort of refer back, I guess, back to data again. I'm wearing the data hat today. There's some costs associated with it, right? I think with all of these things, I'm sure the others would agree that to be open and to do things transparently, and openly, whether that's fair data or open source software, or open access publications, there's usually costs associated with it, and that's costs in terms of like money in some cases, and costs in terms of time and effort. Like, you have to put a little bit of time in, a little bit of effort in to look after your data and make sure that your data is fair, to adopt standards and to add appropriate metadata and share it in a public archive. There's costs associated with these things, and they're upfront costs. And the temptation is always to say, oh, I'll do it later. I'll worry about it later when I really need to. But actually, the cost of doing them, assimilating them from the start and setting good habits tend to mean that you don't have to pay quite such significant costs later on. So it's like, do you want £5 now, $5 now, or $100 in 3 years' time? People will say, oh yeah, maybe I'll take the $100 in 3 years' time. It's not that much and it's miles away. And I think there's kind of this interesting sort of dynamic about, I don't want to pay the price. There's some costs associated with doing that. I don't want to pay the price of it. But in general, my experience, especially with fair data, is always it is much easier to start fair than to try and curate later. And I don't know if the others would agree with publishing and software, and I feel Sandra's pain with the curation load sometimes. But I'll stop there. I think the disadvantage for me is costs, but usually, I think deferring costs is tempting, but not usually the right thing to do.
Renato.
Yeah, so also to bounce from Tony, sorry. On the software side, I would say the technical debt, for instance, that's a very clear cost that if you don't open the community, let's say you're a single researcher, you're developing the software on your own. It's not uncommon these days to have someone that doesn't really have a background in computer science or software engineering developing such kinds of projects, and even the concept of technical debt or all of this kind of hits you in the face much later once your software starts to get adopted and people realize that, oh well, if you would have done the steps before, it might have been a lot easier. And I think on this front, there's also now software management plans that you can pick on, and they push you in the right direction. I would say the same for data management plans. So we are seeing a lot of good things also in that direction.
Yeah, and to follow on for the data, I would actually say it's cheaper to do it correctly than it is to do it than to create your own formats. Because in most data types now, there are established data formats. There are open source tools built to handle those formats. And there is an active community supporting them who are there to help you and advise you and work with you. And if you're moving your data beyond into a next dimension, next generation, we'll be happy to help to extend the existing formats to advance them in parallel with your data advances. Whereas if you're doing your own thing locally, you have to write your own format, invent your own format, or work with something like Excel, which is not ideal for handling data. wonderful though it is for many things, but it really is designed as an accounting software, not as a data handling software. So if you choose to go open right from the very beginning and work with those formats, I think actually you would save yourself money in the long term than trying to keep things behind closed doors and do your own thing, as it were.
Thank you. So sticking with the concept of costs, we have a question from the audience. So they're saying that publishing research in India under open access is very costly. Are there any suggestions about ways that they can do this for researchers who don't necessarily have funding and they would still like to make their publications and data open? Maria?
Yes, so I will say that for data, no, actually, first I'm going to say I hear you, because to be honest, recently there have been absolutely incredible rises in prices for publishing open access in some of the venues that researchers often go to, and it now may cost an outrageous amount to just publish a paper somewhere. That said, I do want to kind of split it into publications and data, because I do think the answer will differ slightly. Regarding publications, well, one thing is that you don't always have to publish through the model where you pay an open access fee to make your science open. One way could be preprint your research, so posting a preprint prior to the publication. There are also venues which are so-called diamond open access. That means that the cost for making the paper open lies with, for example, the library or the institution, and so you can publish for free at no cost to author or the reader. And finally, in cases where everything else fails, most subscription-based publishers will allow you to post an author copy to another repository. So you can always go down that route and still make sure that your research is open to somebody else to read. Now, regarding open data, I'm going to probably leave it to data experts, but I think there are also many different ways to open up your data without significant costs.
Yeah, I mean, data deposition certainly is free, so we can't make it any cheaper than that. And we'll work with you to get it into the repositories with as much what Tony referred to as metadata. For those that don't know what the term means, that's the additional information that enriches the data. So you can tell us as little as I saw your protein, or you can add metadata, which is I saw your protein in a hepatocyte cell line that had been treated with EGF for 10 minutes at 37 degrees C. So that is the additional information that gives value to that data. So we can most of the repositories can handle that additional data and take that for you. Now, we would generally link that to a publication. It's not essential, but it obviously makes your work more visible, adds to the richness of the data as well. But as Maria was saying, that repository, that doesn't have to be through an expensive journal. There are many other ways we can link to that, and through EuropeAMC, we've got access to all of them. So we're more than happy to link to a preprint in most cases, or to another publishing mechanism. And many journals that initially keep the data in a subscription model, you can argue the case in many cases and say, I need this to be public because it's of importance to the community. And some will occasionally make the data public the paper public immediately. Others will insist on a year for subscription, but then will eventually make it public. So again, even if you want to go through the formal journal publication route, it's worth arguing with the publishers, because most of them are used to this argument and will eventually give you some ground, some leeway on this as well. So just bear that in mind. Even the most prestigious journals will make the occasional article open access, and will certainly, after a certain time limit, consider it.
Maria, did you want to continue that?
I just wanted to comment that even for publishers, for subscription-based publishers where the author doesn't pay the fee, but the paper itself is paywalled, most of them actually require that the data is openly available because for reviewers, for example, that is of huge importance. So many papers will not be accepted if the data isn't shared through standard community-led repositories. In their attempt to open up as much as possible, some researchers even go as far as to deposit figures before publishing and then refer to figures in the paper as data, thereby having them open. I don't think that that's necessarily the best way to go, but I do know that if you want to keep as much of your publication or information that you're planning to share open, there are definitely ways.
Okay, thank you. Sticking with the idea of preprints, Maria, would you be able to talk a bit about the advantages and whether there's any disadvantages to the author of putting preprints out before peer-reviewed publication?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, preprints have been around for a very long time. If you think of archive and physics, they are a bit newer to biology and then even newer to some other disciplines. But they are slowly becoming much more mainstream. And there are definitely risks that are associated with preprints. So the two that are kind of most commonly cited are risks to authors in terms of not being able to publish their paper in their journal of choice. And that is true. Some journals still don't accept preprints as a sort of pre-publishing mechanism. However, that is changing, and now so many more publishers will say that it is absolutely okay to preprint before you publish with them. But it is still a changing field, and you always need to check with the publisher's policies before you decide to preprint, if that's the main kind of choice you're going to be having. But also there are some disadvantages to readers, and that is mainly not having the stamp of peer review. So many argue that, especially in the wake of COVID pandemic, there were preprints put out with below average quality data, some that were outright pseudoscience and weren't properly planned out. And to that, I want to say, well, that happens already with peer-reviewed publications. As you know, one of the most famous examples is the link between vaccines and autism that was disproved many years ago and yet still gets cited many times a year. So there are definitely risks, but there are benefits that kind of mitigate some of those risks as well. And so one is that preprints are a great way to get feedback. And so in that sense, you know, any pseudoscience that gets reported there can also equally be quickly disproved by the members of the community. But also for authors who genuinely have posted a preprint that could be improved, they can get valuable feedback before submitting their manuscript to a journal. And so having fewer rounds of peer review to go through. There are benefits in terms of higher visibility and citation. Studies have shown that research that's been preprinted gets more citations after being published in the journal. There's also the visibility. There's also the priority establishment. Sort of you can publish your preprint much faster than it usually takes people to go through the whole peer review process, which could be a few months to years. It's also a way to make your science open. So it's free to readers and authors, as I mentioned. And so it's really a great tool in the open science toolbox.
On a similar thread, we have a question from the audience about the possibility of being scooped by a competitor if you submit your data, your raw data. Does anyone have any comments on ways to mitigate that, or if they see that as a problem at all? Sandra?
Well, I have never heard of it happening. It's a much repeated fallacy, I think. Most repositories will hold your data privately until your paper is published anyway. You are the person who tells the repositories when they release their data, it remains your data, and it's your right to say when it goes out. So you just don't release the data until the day the paper comes out. But when you think of the months and months you have probably spent analysing your data, unless you're really the slowest paper writer in the world, even if it had gone public immediately, there wouldn't have been time for people to reanalyze the data anyway before your paper went out. What can happen, of course, is that the data may be reanalyzed several years down the road as techniques move on and advance, but that's really seen as a real positive because it's generating more knowledge from your original data.
Maria, you had your hand up quickly on that one too.
Yes, so what I wanted to say is that I think as scientists, we often kind of rely on a data-driven approach for the science itself, but not as much for the science communication. And so to answer that question, what we can do is look at the evidence that we already have. And so from my perspective, I'm going to present some evidence on preprints because that is a very common question that people have. If I publish my study as a preprint, will somebody be able to scoop me and publish that same paper in another journal? And the answer is it doesn't really happen. So I know that, you know, there's been a study where the study authors were looking for people who had suffered that fate, and they couldn't find enough examples. And so in some ways, it's also to do with you know, if there's somebody who really works on the same approach, the chances are they have the same set of data already, or they can get it as well. And in the end, I mean, having your data openly available, that's also a sort of a claim to being the first, because you've literally created the data set and published it, and so you definitely will get credit for that. But the bigger question is perhaps, well, what is it that you're afraid of, that you won't be able to publish something about this data? You know, what's the real concern behind saying, well, I'm going to be scooped? Is it that you're worried that the funder won't acknowledge this, the institution won't acknowledge this, that you won't be able to publish? And the answer to all those is no. Really, it should be okay.
I think that's very good to hear. And Tony?
Yeah, I mean, I think we all want to chip in on this, right? So, you know, I mean, there is this kind of sort of fairly famous sort of research parasite claim that went around a few years ago of this idea of actually open data sharing sort of playing into this ecosystem of research parasites who sort of trawl the bioinformatics data worlds, hoovering up other people's data and publishing on it before they can. And I agree with Sandra and Maria that, like, you know, I've never heard of it happening. You know, I'm sure you could find cases where it does, and you know. But I would also say, you know, it feels like highly unethical behavior to me to just go hoover up other people's data, publish on it, not credit them or attribute them in any way. And, you know, in general, I would sort of like always look at myself and say, well, would I do this? And the answer for me is always no. And you know, then you sort of then go down that path of thinking, well, does anyone I know, would anyone I know do that? And when the answer to that is also no, then you start to get into this scenario of like, is this really going to happen? You know, or am I sort of afraid of something that is very, very unlikely? And, you know, I think it's the second one. But I also will refer back to the earlier point that I made as well, which, you know, to mitigate some of these fears and some of these worries, you know, I think we just don't have the right incentives, right? The right incentives and the right attribution mechanisms to say the data of this group is critically important to my efforts, you know, and sort of, you know, that like the genomics and bioinformatics field's got a long history of that, right, all the way back to the structure of DNA, right? So people would say, well, yeah, did Rosalind Franklin get attributed properly for her efforts, you know, and she generated some of the data. So, you know, like I would love to see better attribution, but the idea of being scooped, I think, is more of a fear than a realistic possibility.
Okay, and to Renato?
Yeah, so I would like to also add here the angle of perhaps when these days submitting your own data, or when you're working for your publication, you do need to submit the data to back your own findings. So if you would be in a situation where the data was not yours, or you cannot really refer to it, then you would be in a bit of a unfortunate situation, right? So in a lot of cases, I would say almost that nowadays citation or referencing is inevitable. So I would consider this more of a fear or an uncertainty factor in science rather than a reality in most of the cases. And on another angle, I mean, I would like to flip this into a more positive tone, which is that if we don't do this kind of opening and we don't have this open attitude, the research is a common good. So whatever findings, whatever we come out of, it's for a greater purpose. And often by simply opening your process, your data, your findings, that's also how collaboration gets generated, and that's how a lot of research gets even beyond what you initially conceived or considered, because suddenly there's another angle about something that you didn't take into account. And just to add another point to something that was mentioned before, for instance, regarding preprints, and Maria did mention the lifetime of the publication process often. So personal stories, I have some to say on that as well, but I think we all experienced the very long publication process and evaluation. And if you're talking about resources, databases, software, there's another factor to add to this, which is things age. Software gets old, it becomes outdated, technologies get obsolete. And so if your work, no matter when you did it, stays in a drawer for many years because the publication process is delayed or anything, then your work is also losing value. So to open up this process as early as possible is also to your own advantage and to the advantage of the scientific community.
Thank you. And to Maria.
I just wanted to add to the attribution point that Tony raised. So I agree. And in Europe, PMC, we've been kind of starting to think about that for a bit. And so we now added data citations as sort of a impact metric, if you wish, although I do kind of not really like that word, because I mean, it matters what you do with that metric. You know, you shouldn't judge somebody based on a number on a graph, but still, we do think that it's important to highlight that. And I will say that sometimes people cite the data without citing the paper, and sometimes they'll cite the paper without citing the data. And it's only by combining the two that we can kind of really gauge the impact that the study as a whole made for the research community. But yeah, we're definitely looking into that, and that is something that we are particularly keen to explore. You know, how do we give credit for the data? And I think, again, another thing that will play into this is ORCID claiming for data. So for those who don't know, ORCID is a unique researcher identifier. So it's kind of a number that's associated with you as a researcher, and then under that number lives a record of all of the work that you've done, that may be data or software or publications or funding. And so adding data to your ORCID record, that could be a way to kind of keep track of it. And then that is definitely something that I envisage we will submit to the funding calls or promotion applications, because it is important.
Yeah, and I very quickly just wanted to echo Renato and then Maria's sort of slightly more positive spin on this as well, which, you know, I think is absolutely right. You know, fundamentally, like bioinformatics and the sort of data-driven science that we do is a really collaborative effort, right? You know, it takes people working in the lab and on code and actually people writing and disseminating that research up. You know, it is a team sport, right? And actually being open and public about these things can really help you find collaborators. You know, the number of like hackathons that I've been to that's been looking at open data sets and sort of trying to find novel insights through writing new code or combining existing workflows together. You know, I think this kind of collaborative effort, the more that we can do to sort of instill that, the better. You know, it's a really sort of vibrant community. The idea that you might be able to publish your data and then find someone who wants to work with you to help you analyze it, I think is you know, that's awesome, right? Like, you know, we shouldn't be worried about that. We should embrace it, right?
Thank you. So moving on to some of the questions from the audience. So we have one here, I think it's probably back to Tony for this one. Are there instances where research funded by the private sector may discourage fair practices because of economic interests? How can we deal with that? And I'd quite like to add a question on the flip side to that of what should companies, private sector companies, be doing to help support fair principles?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. And I think that my experience is that there's a shift that that has been happening for some time from many companies and pharmaceutical companies considering their data as somehow sort of proprietary and secret. There are high value, like secretive data sets, but I also spend a lot of time working with big pharmaceutical companies who recognize the importance of the fair data principles just within their own organizations. So, actually across pharmaceutical companies, it's often very, very difficult to find data assets. And, I'm sure if we've got any people from pharmaceutical companies on the call today, I'm sure they will cite the number of times that they've downloaded and had to pay for the GTEx data set, for example, within one company. And you start to think about these things in terms of should we be open? Should we adopt fair principles? And I think most companies that I speak to certainly say yes. We want to adopt fair principles. We want to adopt shared data standards because internally it helps us assimilate data that's out there in the world into our own analysis pipelines. Internally, it helps us exploit the data assets that we've created ourselves and not recollect data sets again and again and again, or pay to download GTEx many times. Internally, it helps us keep our data house in order. And then it's actually a fairly simple step from then to say, now I can publish this data. Once I'm confident that it's not some sort of highly valuable asset, we'll just publish it and we'll just share it, that's the shift that at least I've seen happening. Is companies are basically adopting standards and fair principles to help them internally, but then it makes it a very easy step to just step out into a fully open scenario once you think your competitive advantage might go away. And of course, competitive advantage for big pharmaceutical companies is really, really important. We shouldn't seek to try and work around that, but making that barrier as thin as possible, I think, is advantageous to everyone. Hope I answered the question.
I think so. I'm sure we'll see a comment. So thinking about the advantages that Renato mentioned around sharing open code before, so building a community around a project and sort of working collaboratively, do you think it's currently possible, or potentially in the future there could be a way of doing a similar thing around open data? So you have your data sets and being able to get input from other people and sharing and building a project around that. So do you think that's something that already exists with some kinds of data? And if not, why not, and could it, I suppose, is my question. This is quite an open one, but if anyone does have any thoughts on this, I'd be interested to hear.
Well,
Sandra,
well, there's certainly data types that exist. So there are proteomics communities that came together to create open standards. In the early days, the microarray really blazed this trail. So at the technology level, these groups already exist. At the data level, they've kind of been built around pieces of data. So the human genome, for instance, is an enormous community built around that, and many of our resources are absolutely dependent on it. So a single big, well-funded project will almost certainly attract a community because it has such a huge impact on the work that we do and the way we go forward. So yes, I believe those already exist. And it's easy to build a community. You just put your data out there and shout for input. Well, easy is perhaps a long word, but it is possible to build a community.
Renato?
Yeah, I would also like to add a little story here from one project that I was involved with, and the authors decided to open the data very early in the process, and other people that were working in the same field, they could access the data, they could identify problems early on, and the original authors still had time to address some of those issues, either by repeating experiments or rerunning things, maybe cleaning up some of the data. And once all of this process was completed, the final submission, the data looked considerably different from what it was in its early stages. If this, you can then think if this is an example of an evolving kind of process around data. I do consider it similar, but it also comes with its own challenges. But I agree that for some platforms, it would be nice to have perhaps some sort of standard pipeline of how to report, how to improve, and how to not treat data as an immutable sort of object that is frozen in time and never once touched again.
And Maria.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add a perspective, being a community manager, that definitely there are communities that exist, and there are some communities that are very active around data and data curation. So I'll name Flybases for an example. And so there, even, you know, some of the tasks that curators typically undertake, they can be partially done by the community, and the input is greatly appreciated. But I do see that, you know, that is also an effort. And so it certainly helps when there are stewards within the community, when there are advocates who can take it forward, because in my experience, science has been a very lonely project. And so that starts with this idea that every PhD student, every postdoc in the lab works on their own project. And so although collaboration is encouraged, it's often not teamwork. And so building that sense of community where people belong rather than collaborating based on needs of bringing different expertise to the project, I think that would tremendously help. And I think we still have a long way to go there for the data communities as such.
I think we could probably talk about open access for a few hours, but we are running out of time, unfortunately. But Maria, just before we do finish, you mentioned earlier about open fostering inclusivity, and I was wondering if you could just briefly talk a little more on that.
Yes, so I think when we say, what does open mean to you? That already tells us that there isn't currently a definition that works for everybody. And partially, to me, it's because open isn't the goal as such. You know, it's what we can achieve with all these things that fall under the umbrella of open science that we really strive for. You know, things like reproducibility, like trustworthiness, like speed of science and dissemination, like ease, like reaching general public. And so with that in mind, I think there are still a few open pieces that are missing. One example for me personally has been with the COVID pandemic and the long COVID sufferers who couldn't reach the scientific community to explain what was happening to them. Studies have been started on this without consulting with the public as much as we perhaps should have. You know, so that's something that I definitely think should be explored. We are now starting to talk about science being global. So that's, again, something that's been raised at many conferences, including the UNESCO Open Science Meeting. You know, how do we ensure that we truly collaborate on a global scale? How do we ensure that we raise all these questions that as humans, we all generally are really striving to answer? And so I just essentially wanted to say that I think open doesn't stop at open access to publications, at open access to data, at open access to software. There will have to be more and more levels of open. And maybe we will never achieve them all, and I think that's okay. But there are definitely points where they're going to be more important than others. And so that's something that I wish we could all explore together.
Thank you, Maria. I think that was an excellent way to wrap up this afternoon. And I think if one thing we've shown that we're very enthusiastic around open, and we hope you are too. And we hope we've provided some new possibilities and options for ways in which you can become more open. And speaking of, the recording for today will be made available, and we have a CC BY license on that recording. We will send out the link to you early next week, and you should feel free to share that with any colleagues, when you think may benefit from hearing what we've been talking about today. I know we didn't get a chance to get to everyone's questions, but do feel free to email the team, email in response to that link that comes out next week, and we'll always be sure to get back to you on your questions. Alex has just popped the link to the other recordings from this series into the chat. From that link, this recording will also appear next week, but I'd really encourage you to take a look at those recordings if you weren't able to join us for those webinars. There's some really interesting points around finding, accessing data, sharing software, sharing code, and accessing open publications and preprints. So definitely recommend you take a look at those and see if there's anything of interest to you there. Okay, so I think that just leaves me to say thank you very much to the panel for joining us and for sharing your thoughts and ideas and possibilities for what everyone can get involved in. And thank you very much to everyone for joining us and for submitting your questions and getting involved in our conversation. So we hope to see you at a webinar in the future. If you're interested, next Wednesday's webinar is on programmatic access of Ensemble. So I'm sure that will appeal to a few of you. Okay, so thank you all, and hope to see you at a webinar again in the future.